the silence in the obsidian vault wasn't peaceful. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of men who knew they were out of time. On the massive digital display, a red line representing a $4 million shipment simply ended. In the middle of a highway. No crash, no signal jam, no SOS. Just a void. That's the third one tonight, hissed Julian Vance. He didn't scream. He didn't have to. He sat at the head of the table, his fingers laced together, looking at the 14 men he had paid a combined $2 million in retainers. 14 of the best logistics and security minds in the hemisphere. And yet my cargo is vanishing like smoke in a breeze. Sterling Vane, a man who had secured gold transports in war zones, wiped a bead of cold sweat from his upper lip. Sir, the encryption is unhackable. The drivers are vetted. The GPS says they are moving, but the weight sensors say the trailers are empty. It's a physical impossibility. I don't pay for impossibilities, Sterling. I pay for steel and certainty. Julian's voice dropped an octave, a predatory growl. You have 10 minutes to give me a name or a method, or I start reclaiming my investment from your hides. Before we dive deeper into this high-stakes pressure cooker, I want to welcome you all. It's truly great to have you here for this story. I'd love to know where you're watching from. Let me know in the comments. If you haven't yet, please hit that subscribe button and join our community. It really helps us bring these intense stories to life. How are you all holding up today? Ready to see how this unfolds? The 14 experts scrambled back to their tablets, their voices a panicked, overlapping mess of technical jargon and desperate theories. They were looking at satellite sweeps, checking for hidden ramps, analyzing the asphalt for trapdoors. They were looking for a high-tech ghost. In the corner of the room, Elena Riggs moved like a shadow. To these men, she was nothing but a pair of hands that replaced empty carafes of coffee and wiped away the stains of their failure. They didn't see the way her eyes lingered on the monitors. They didn't see her jaw tighten every time they missed the obvious. Elena's life was a series of disappearing acts. Her father had disappeared when she was 6. Her mother's health had disappeared into a mountain of medical debt. Now, Elena spent her days disappearing into the background of elite offices, cleaning up after men who earned more in an hour than she saw in a year. She was $400 short on rent, and her sister's tuition was due Tuesday. She couldn't afford to be noticed, but she also couldn't afford to watch such expensive stupidity. She walked toward the head of the table to clear a tray of cold espresso cups. As she reached out, her eyes caught the heat map Sterling was obsessing over. He was pointing at a 2-mile stretch of forest road. They have to be offloading it here, Sterling barked. It's the only place with no direct overhead cover. Elena's hand paused over a cup. She looked at the clock on the screen, 3:14 a.m. Then she looked at the weather overlay in the corner. Then she looked at the driver's manifest. It's not the trees, she murmured. It was barely a breath, but in the sudden, terrified silence of the room, it rang out like a gunshot. Julian Vance's eyes shifted. They didn't move to Sterling. They moved to Elena. He saw a girl in a faded uniform, her knuckles red from bleach, looking at a map that had defeated the best minds in the country. What did you say, girl? Sterling snapped, his face turning a humiliated shade of purple. Go back to your mop. I said it's not the trees, Elena said, her voice gaining a sharp, desperate edge. You're looking at the map like it's a board game. You're ignoring the people. Julian leaned forward, the light hitting the scars on his hands. The experts say it's a security breach. You say it's people. You have 60 seconds to prove them wrong, or I let my head of security personally escort you to the exit. And I don't mean the door. Elena didn't blink. She grabbed a greasy ballpoint pen from the table and a discarded napkin. She didn't look at the experts. She looked at the reality of the road, the reality of men who are tired, hungry, and bored. The shipments aren't being stolen, Elena said, her pen flying across the napkin, drawing a jagged line that didn't follow the highway. They're being traded. And you've been watching the wrong side of the clock. In exactly 60 seconds, the girl who didn't exist was about to prove that 14 geniuses were looking at the world through a lens of ego, while she was looking at it through the lens of survival. The room held its breath as the experts stared at the napkin in Elena's hand. To them it was trash. To Julian Vance it was a challenge. Elena didn't look at the 14 men who were currently calculating how to ruin her life for speaking up. She looked at Julian. She saw the way his eyes never left hers, Not out of attraction but out of a cold, predatory assessment. He was a man who lived in the details of death and commerce, and she was a woman who lived in the details of pennies and persistence. You think they're trading? Julian asked, his voice a low hum that vibrated through the mahogany table. My drivers are hand-picked. Their families are taken care of. They wouldn't dare. They aren't daring, Elena countered, her voice growing steadier as she channeled the adrenaline of her own desperation. They're falling into a rhythm. You see an empire, I see a schedule. These drivers leave the depot at 2 a.m. They hit the mountain pass at 4:30 a.m. That's exactly when the body hits its lowest metabolic point. They aren't offloading at a warehouse. They're stopping for what every person at the end of a graveyard shift wants. A human moment. She pointed to a tiny, unmarked dot on the topographical map. A small gravel turnout that wasn't an official rest stop. There's a food truck that parks there. It's not on your GPS because it's mobile. It's run by a woman named Clara. She doesn't take cards. She only takes cash, or favors. Your drivers aren't being hijacked. They're swapping one crate of high-end electronics for a thermos of spiked coffee and a warm meal because they're exhausted and they think nobody is watching a 2-minute handoff. Sterling Vane let out a harsh, mocking laugh. A food truck? You're suggesting a multi-million-dollar leak is caused by breakfast burritos? Julian, this is absurd. This girl is a distraction. Julian didn't look at Sterling. He didn't even acknowledge his existence. Tell me about the expectation gaps you mentioned, he commanded Elena. You expect them to be machines, Elena said, her eyes flashing. The experts build your routes based on the speed of the truck and the distance of the road. But they don't account for the fact that at 4 a.m., a human being is lonely. They don't account for the blind minute, where the driver turns off the interior cabin light to rest his eyes. That's the gap. That's when the exchange happens. The weight stays the same because the crates they put back are filled with the same weight in scrap metal. The seals look intact because they aren't breaking them, they're swapping the entire door hinges. As she spoke, the silhouette of Elena's own life began to bleed through. She wasn't just guessing, she knew this world. She knew the woman who ran that food truck. She knew what it felt like to be so tired your vision blurred, and how much you'd give just for a moment of kindness in the dark. Elena lived in a 2-bedroom apartment in the slums of the outer district with her sister, Maya. Maya was brilliant. A cello prodigy who had a scholarship to the conservatory, provided Elena could pay the administrative fees that were essentially a legal bribe. Elena's motivation wasn't greed. It was the suffocating fear that her sister would end up just like her, invisible, holding a mop, being yelled at by men who couldn't see the truth if it bit them. Julian watched her, noting the frayed collar of her uniform and the sharp, hungry intelligence in her gaze. He had spent his life surrounded by yes-men and specialists, who told him what he wanted to hear. He had never met someone who looked at his multi-billion-dollar problem and saw a human error. What's your name? Julian asked. Elena Riggs, she replied, refusing to look down. And why are you telling me this, Elena? You could have let them keep failing. You could have walked out that door. Because I hate seeing people lose things when the answer is right in front of them, she said, though the truth was simpler. She needed him to see her. She needed to be more than a shadow. Before we see how Julian reacts to this revelation, I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever been in a situation where you saw the solution but felt like no one was listening? Tell me your story in the comments. And if you're finding Elena as captivating as I am, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss her next move. In the corner, Elias Thorne was frantically typing into his tablet. Sir, I'm checking the mobile vendor permits for that sector. There is a registration for a Clara's Kitchen that moves along that route. But it's never been flagged. Because you were looking for a tank, not a toaster, Elena muttered. Julian stood up. He was a head taller than everyone else, a tower of tailored wool and cold intent. He walked around the table until he stood directly in front of Elena. The 14 experts shrunk back, expecting a bloodbath. 1 minute, Julian whispered, echoing his earlier threat. You solved in 1 minute what these men couldn't solve in 3 days. He turned to his head of security, a mountain of a man named Silas Stone. Silas, take a team to the gravel turnout. If there's a food truck there, bring the driver and the vendor to me. If there isn't. He looked back at Elena. Then Miss Riggs will be taking a very long walk. Elena felt the air leave her lungs. She had gambled her life on the habits of a truck driver she'd watched from a distance at her second job. She was terrified, but she didn't let her knees shake. She had lived in the darkest hour her entire life. A little more shadow didn't scare her anymore. As Silas marched out, the 14 experts began to whisper, their egos bruised and their fear mounting. They looked at Elena with pure, unadulterated hatred. She had made them look like fools, and in Julian Vance's world, being a fool was a capital offense. But Julian wasn't looking at them. He was looking at the napkin. He picked it up, folding it neatly and tucking it into his breast pocket. "Sit down, Elena," Julian said, gesturing to the chair at the head of the table, the seat of power. "I think it's time we discussed your salary." The room felt like an overpressurized boiler. Elena Riggs sat in the chair Julian had indicated. The leather was still warm from his presence. Opposite her, 14 elite strategists looked as though they wanted to incinerate her with their stares. They weren't just embarrassed, they were obsolete. And in the underworld, obsolescence meant being discarded. Julian didn't sit. He paced the perimeter of the room, his footsteps heavy and rhythmic. "Silas is 10 minutes out from the turnout," he said, his voice flat. "In 10 minutes we find out if a waitress is a genius or a hallucination. But while we wait, something else is bothering me." He stopped behind Sterling Vane and placed a hand on the man's shoulder. Sterling flinched. "Miss Riggs," Julian said, looking across the room at her. "My experts told me the encryption on the GPS trackers was unhackable. They told me the trucks never stopped for more than 90 seconds. How did you know about the blind minute?" Elena took a breath, her mind racing. "Because I work at the diner 3 miles down from your main depot. Every morning at 2 a.m., your drivers come in for a pre-shift coffee. They don't talk to the managers. They talk to me. They talk about how the new biometric seats are uncomfortable. They talk about how the eye-tracking cameras in the cabs can be fooled by a simple infrared LED taped to a pair of glasses. They aren't hackers, Mr. Vance. They're just bored men who want to reclaim a little bit of their own time." "It's a lie." Elias Thorne erupted, slamming his tablet down. "The infrared bypass is a myth. Our systems are calibrated to detect thermal signatures of the human eye. A waitress couldn't possibly." The door to the vault swung open with a violent bang. Silas Stone walked in, but he wasn't alone. He was dragging a man in a greased-up jumpsuit, one of Julian's senior drivers, and a woman with flour-stained hands. Silas threw a heavy black crate onto the mahogany table. It hit with a thud that echoed like a gavel. "We found them," Silas said, breathing hard. "The food truck was at the gravel turnout. They were in the middle of a handoff. This crate was supposed to contain high-density processors. I opened it at the scene." Julian stepped forward and flipped the lid. Inside, instead of shimmering silicon and gold-plated tech, was a pile of rusted iron rebar, cut to the exact weight of the original cargo. The silence that followed was terrifying. Julian turned to the driver, who was now trembling so hard his teeth were chattering. "Who set this up?" The driver looked at the 14 experts, then at Julian and finally at the floor. "It wasn't a heist, boss. It was a trade. We just wanted out. The quotas, the sensors, the way you treat us like we're part of the engine. Clara offered us a way to make a year's pay in a night just by letting her borrow the crates for 10 minutes while we ate." Julian looked at Elena. For the first time, there was something in his eyes that wasn't cold. It was recognition. "The experts were looking for a war," Julian whispered. "You found a rebellion." Suddenly, the lights in the vault flickered and died. A secondary alarm began to wail, a low, guttural pulse of sound that signaled a perimeter breach. "Boss, we have a problem," Silas barked, reaching for his sidearm. "The tracking pings on the rest of the fleet just went dark. All of them. Simultaneously." "That shouldn't be possible," Sterling stammered, his face pale in the emergency red glow of the room. "Even if they're swapping cargo, the GPS should stay live." "It's not the drivers anymore," Elena said, her voice sharp with a new fear. She had seen the pattern on the napkin and she realized she'd missed one terrifying detail. The food truck. It wasn't just a trade post. It was a Trojan horse. "What do you mean, a Trojan horse?" Julian demanded, grabbing Elena's arm, not to hurt her, but to keep her from disappearing into the shadows. "The infrared LEDs," Elena whispered, looking at the driver. "The ones you used to fool the cameras. Who gave them to you?" The driver looked up, tears streaming down his face. The woman, Clara. She said they were just to give us a break from the surveillance. She said they were a gift from the union. There is no union, Julian snarled. Exactly, Elena said. They weren't just LEDs. They were signal broadcasters. Every driver you have has been driving around with a key to your entire encrypted network inside their cab for weeks. They didn't just steal your cargo, Mr. Vance. They just opened the door to your house. At that moment, the vault's main screen flickered back to life, but it wasn't showing the logistics map. It was showing a live feed of the building's basement. A group of men in tactical gear, not Julian's men, were moving toward the server room. The 14 experts were useless, frozen in a state of shock. But Julian Vance, the most dangerous man in the city, didn't look at the screen. He looked at the poor waitress who was currently holding the only map to his survival. Silas, lock the floor, Julian commanded. And Plana, don't move. You're not a waitress anymore. You're my chief of operations. Now tell me how we stop them. The mystery had just evolved from a simple theft into a full-scale coup, and the only person who understood the enemy's human tactics was a woman who had spent her life being ignored. The red emergency lights bathed the obsidian vault in a rhythmic, bloody pulse. Julian's empire, a machine of cold precision, was grinding to a halt. The 14 experts were now worse than useless. They were a liability, hyperventilating as they realized their unhackable systems had been turned into a roadmap for an invasion. They're in the elevator shafts, Silas reported, his hand tightening on his weapon as he monitored a handheld scanner. Internal security is being bypassed by the same signal the girl identified. Our own scanners are welcoming them in like guests. Julian looked at Elena. The power dynamic in the room had shifted entirely. The 14 men who previously occupied the space were now background noise, while the woman in the faded uniform was the only one whose eyes remained fixed on the problem. How do we cut the signal? Julian asked. His voice was calm, but there was a sharp edge of urgency. If those LEDs are the keys, how do we lock the door? Elena's mind raced. She thought about the drivers at the diner, how they complained about the truck's interference with their radio stations. You can't just turn it off, she said, her fingers flying over the mahogany table as if it were a keyboard. The system is designed to stay open for emergency maintenance, if the signal is active. But these signals are low frequency. They're meant to be subtle. She looked at Sterling Vane, who was slumped in his chair. You, she barked. The expert looked up, startled. The trucks have an automated fire suppression system in the cargo bays, right? It uses a concentrated CO2 burst. Yes, Sterling stammered. But what does that have to do with? The CO2 canisters are housed in lead-lined casings to prevent accidental discharge from external heat, Elena explained, turning back to Julian. If we trigger the fire suppression manually across the fleet, the gas won't stop the hackers, but the lead casings will act as a temporary Faraday cage. It will muffle the signal just enough for the main server to lose the handshake. It will buy us time to hard reset the encryption. Julian's eyes narrowed. It was a brilliant human fix, using a physical object to solve a digital ghost. Do it, he commanded Sterling. As the expert scrambled to comply, the room shook. A heavy thud vibrated through the floor. The attackers had reached the 14th floor. They're at the blast doors, Silas shouted. In the midst of this chaos, a strange moment of vulnerability flickered between Julian and Elena. As the experts panicked, Julian stepped closer to her. He was the city's most feared predator, yet he looked at her with a raw curiosity. You're not just a waitress, Elena Riggs, he murmured, his voice barely audible over the sirens. Where did you learn to think like a ghost? When you spend your life being invisible, Elena replied, looking him in the eye, you learn how every shadow is cast. You learn how the lights work so you can stay out of them. There was a sudden jarring spark of attraction, not the kind found in a ballroom but the kind found in a foxhole. Two people from opposite ends of the world, united by the fact that they were both in their own way survivors. Julian reached out, his thumb brushing a smudge of coffee off her cheek. It was a gesture of startling intimacy in a room full of dying egos. Before the doors burst open, I have to know, what would you do if you were in Elena's shoes? Would you help a man like Julian Vance, or would you let the empire burn? Let me know in the comments. And if you're holding your breath like I am, hit that subscribe button right now so you don't miss the midpoint revelation. The screen suddenly hissed with static. Sterling let out a cry of triumph. The signal is dropping. The Faraday effect worked. I'm initiating the hard reset on the server room doors. But the victory was short-lived. The main monitor didn't go back to the logistics map. Instead, a face appeared. It was a man Elena recognized, not from the underworld but from the news. It was Arthur Penhaligon, a legitimate tech billionaire and Julian's primary rival in the city's infrastructure development. Julian, Arthur said, his voice smooth and devoid of heat. I see you found a clever little mouse to help you. But you're thinking too small. I didn't just want your shipments. I wanted your reputation. By the time the sun rises, the police will find evidence on those food trucks that links your entire operation to a series of international crimes even you can't bribe your way out of. Julian stiffened. You're framing the drivers. I'm framing the system, Arthur countered. And since you're experts, were kind enough to leave the back door open for 3 days, the trail is already cold. Enjoy the darkness, Julian. The screen went black. The lights stayed red. Elena looked at the napkin again. She saw the lines she had drawn, the human path. She realized Arthur Penhaligon hadn't just outplayed Julian. He had used the driver's exhaustion as a weapon. But she also saw a flaw in Arthur's plan, a detail a billionaire would never consider because he had never had to count his change at a laundromat. He's lying, Elena said, her voice a cold whisper. Lying about what? Julian asked, turning to her. About the trail being cold, Elena said, a predatory smile finally touching her lips. He thinks he's erased his tracks, but he forgot about the one thing that never lies in this city, the toll. The atmosphere in the vault shifted from panicked to lethal. Julian Vance moved toward Elena, his presence commanding the space between them. The toll, he repeated, his eyes searching hers. Arthur has high-level clearance. He owns the digital infrastructure. There are no records of his teams moving through the city's gates. Digital records, no, Elena said, her mind firing with the clarity of a high-voltage wire. But Arthur is a man who believes in algorithms. He believes that if you delete a line of code, the event never happened. He forgot about the physical reality of the city. She turned back to the mahogany table, sweeping aside the expensive tablets and focusing on a map of the city's older industrial sector, the Rust Belt that modern tech ignored. The trucks Clara used, they weren't modern. They're old diesel models, heavy-duty. To get from the mountain pass to Arthur's private shipping yards without being seen by your satellite experts, they had to use the old wharf bridge. Sterling Vane scoffed, trying to reclaim some dignity. The old wharf bridge has been automated for a decade. The sensors are linked to the same grid Arthur just compromised. He would have wiped the passage logs instantly. He wiped the cloud logs, Elena countered, her voice sharp enough to draw blood. But the old wharf bridge is a historical landmark. Because of the saltwater corrosion on the sensors, the city still requires a physical backup. There's a mechanical weight counter, a literal iron wheel that turns every time an axle passes over it. It's analog. It's clunky. And it's impossible to hack from a laptop in a penthouse. Julian's face transformed. It wasn't just a smile. It was the look of a man who had just been handed the heart of his enemy. He thinks he's a ghost, but he left a footprint in the mud. But that's not the revelation, Elena said, her voice dropping to a whisper as she looked at the time. Sir, look at the screen. Look at the logistics loop Arthur just flashed. She pointed to a flickering data point on the now dark monitor. Arthur isn't just framing you for the thefts. He's using your fleet to move something else. Those empty crates they were swapping? They weren't just filled with rebar to trick your scales. Look at the thermal residual on the empty return trips. Julian leaned in. His breath hitched. The thermal map showed faint glowing signatures, pulsing rhythmic heat. Those aren't processors, Julian whispered, the horror finally reaching his voice. Those are heartbeats. The room went ice cold. This wasn't a corporate war. This wasn't just a theft of high-tech cargo. Arthur Penhaligon was using Julian's unhackable and invisible logistics network to move human beings. He was using the Mafia boss's reputation as a shield, knowing that if the authorities ever caught a shipment, the trail would lead straight back to the Obsidian Tower. He's using me as a mule for a trafficking ring, Julian growled. The fury in his voice was so intense that two of the experts physically backed away. In that moment of shared realization, Julian turned to Elena. The barriers of class and power vanished. He reached out and took her hands, not as a boss but as a partner in a nightmare. Elena, if this gets out, if those trucks reach the port, my name is finished. But more importantly, those people, they'll be gone. Elena felt the weight of it. She looked at Julian's scarred hands holding hers. She saw a man who was a criminal, yes, but a man who lived by a code Arthur Penhaligon had just spat on. We have 30 minutes before the ships sail, Elena said, her heart hammering. But the 14 experts you hired are still looking at the satellite feed. They're looking for where the trucks are. And what are you looking for? Julian asked, his gaze locked on hers with a sudden, burning intensity. I'm looking for where the drivers eat, Elena said. Arthur is a billionaire. He fed them cold rations and promises. But I know these men. They've been on the road for 6 hours. Before they hit the port, they will stop at the Anchor, the only 24-hour greasy spoon with a parking lot big enough for a fleet. They think they're safe because it's a low-rent district. They think you're too elite to ever look there. Julian turned to Silas, his eyes glowing with a dark, righteous fire. Get the cars. All of them. And Silas. Yes, boss. Forget the experts. They stay here in the dark. Julian looked back at Elena. The waitress is coming with me. As they headed toward the private elevator, the true scale of the betrayal began to sink in. Elena realized that Arthur hadn't just outsmarted the experts. He had likely bought one of them. The logic that had failed Julian for 3 days wasn't just incompetence. It was sabotage. The midpoint had changed everything. It wasn't a game of money anymore. It was a race for souls, led by a man who owned the city and a woman who cleaned its floors. The rain began to lash against the windshield of the armored SUV as it screamed through the industrial district. Julian sat in the back, his jaw tight, watching the city lights blur into streaks of neon. Beside him, Elena felt smaller than she ever had, despite the power she had just wielded in the vault. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by a cold, hollow dread. We're 5 minutes out, Silas announced from the driver's seat, his eyes glued to the rain-slicked road. But boss, we've got a problem. The police scanners are lighting up. Someone tipped them off that a high-value target is heading toward the Anchor diner. They think you are the one moving the human cargo. Julian let out a sharp, bitter laugh. Arthur is thorough. He's not just stealing my business, he's erasing me from the board. Suddenly, the SUV's dashboard electronics flickered and died. The engine coughed and stalled. Silas fought the steering wheel as the heavy vehicle skidded across the wet asphalt, narrowly missing a concrete pillar before grinding to a halt in the middle of a desolate, warehouse-lined street. What happened? Julian demanded. He burst, Silas hissed, checking his sidearm. Directional. They knew our route. They took out the car's computer. Before Julian could respond, the shadows between the warehouses moved. 4 blacked-out vans swerved around the corner, pinning the SUV in place. Men in tactical gear, the same ones from the basement feed, spilled out, but they weren't wearing police uniforms. These were Arthur's private cleaners. Stay down. Julian grabbed Elena, pulling her toward the floorboards as the first wave of gunfire shattered the SUV's reinforced glass. The world turned into a chaotic symphony of screaming metal and exploding light. Silas returned fire, but they were pinned. The realization hit Elena like a physical blow. They weren't going to make it to the Anchor. The people in those trucks were going to be loaded onto ships, and she and Julian were going to die in a gutter that the world ignored. Julian, Elena whispered, her voice trembling. They aren't just here to kill us. Look. Through the cracked window, she pointed at one of the attackers. He wasn't aiming for the engine. He was holding a thermal scanner, the same kind the experts used. They're looking for the napkin, Julian realized, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. They're looking for the only physical proof that the pattern exists. As long as you have that knowledge, Elena, his lie isn't safe. In the distance, the low, mournful wail of a ship's horn echoed from the harbor. It was the sound of a closing door. I can't do this, Elena sobbed, the weight of the night finally breaking her. I'm a waitress, Julian. I'm nobody. I was just trying to pay my sister's tuition. I'm not a hero. Julian grabbed her shoulders, forcing her to look at him. His eyes were no longer those of a predator. They were the eyes of a man who saw his own soul reflected in her fear. You are the only person in this city who actually looks at what's real, Elena. Arthur has the money. I have the power. But you have the truth. And in the next 10 minutes, the truth is the only thing that matters. A flashbang grenade detonated against the side of the SUV. The world went white. High-pitched ringing drowned out the rain. Elena felt herself being pulled from the car. She felt the cold rain on her face and the rough hands of a mercenary grabbing her arm. I have the girl, a voice shouted over the ringing. Julian was struggling, pinned by 3 men as he fought with a feral, desperate strength. Silas was slumped against the tire, unconscious or worse. As Elena was dragged toward one of the black vans, she looked back at the SUV. She saw the experts were wrong about everything. They thought the story was about logistics. They thought it was about ships and trucks. But as the mercenary shoved her toward the open van door, Elena saw something the attackers had missed. A small neon sign flickered 2 blocks away, partially obscured by the warehouses. Clara's kitchen. The food truck wasn't at the anchor. It had broken down. The human habits she had bet everything on hadn't failed. They had just been interrupted by the same storm that was currently drowning her. Before we see if Elena can find the strength to fight back, I want to check in with you. Have you ever felt like the world was closing in on you just when you were about to win? Leave a comment with the word storm if you've been there. And if you're rooting for Elena to survive this darkest hour, make sure you're subscribed. You won't believe how she turns the tide. Wait. Elena screamed, kicking at the mercenary's shins. The trucks aren't at the port. You're at the wrong coordinate. The mercenary paused, his grip tightening. What did you say? Arthur's perfect plan didn't account for the rain. Elena lied, her voice dripping with a fake, panicked urgency. The weight counter on the bridge. It's flooded. The trucks are backed up at the old wharf. If you kill us now, you'll never find the bypass code. It was a gamble, the biggest one of her life. She was using Arthur's own obsession with codes and systems against his men. The mercenary looked at his radio. He hesitated. And in that second of human hesitation, the shadow of a ship's horn sounded again. But this time, it was followed by a sound Arthur Penhaligon hadn't programmed into his coup. The sound of 60 angry truck drivers, led by a woman with a thermos of spiked coffee, who were tired of being treated like parts of an engine. The mercenary's radio crackled with a frantic, distorted voice. Status check. Why haven't you secured the asset? The port authority is calling in a delay. The man holding Elena looked from his radio to her face. For a split second, the expert training of a cold-blooded killer faltered against the raw, desperate conviction in the eyes of a woman who had nothing left to lose. The bridge is flooded? The mercenary growled, his grip on Elena's arm bruising. If you're lying, I'll drop you into the harbor myself. Check the moisture sensors at the wharf. Elena yelled over the rain. Arthur's software is reporting green, because it's a loop, but the trucks are heavy. They're sinking into the silt of the old road. If they don't move in 3 minutes, the tires will lock in the mud. It was a beautiful, chaotic lie built on a foundation of truth. Elena knew that road. She'd walked it every morning for 3 years to save on bus fare. She knew that when it poured like this, the old wharf road turned into a graveyard for heavy machinery. Suddenly, a blinding pair of high beams cut through the sheets of rain from the opposite end of the street. Then another. And another. It wasn't the police. It wasn't the experts. It was a fleet of mismatched, beat-up civilian vehicles. Pickups, old sedans, and a familiar rusted food truck with a neon open sign hanging by a wire. At the lead was the driver from the vault, the one Julian had nearly broken. Behind him was Clara, standing through the sunroof of her truck, holding a flare. Julian, the driver's voice boomed over a megaphone. The girl was right. We found the trackers in the LEDs. We aren't your mules anymore, and we aren't Arthur's ghosts. The drivers hadn't just fled. They had realized that if Julian fell, they were the ones who would go to prison for Arthur's crimes. Elena's human logic had ignited a spark of self-preservation that had turned into a full-scale mutiny. Julian saw his opening. With a roar of effort, he slammed his head back into the nose of the man holding him, twisted free, and dived for Silas's discarded weapon. Elena! Run! Julian shouted. But Elena didn't run away. She ran toward the food truck. She knew Arthur's men were trained to fight soldiers, not a mob of angry blue-collar workers who knew every alleyway and shortcut in the district. As the mercenaries turned their guns toward the approaching fleet, the truck drivers didn't stop. They used their vehicles as battering rams, slamming into the black vans with the practiced ease of men who spent 12 hours a day maneuvering in tight spaces. Before the final confrontation begins, I want to ask you, who do you think is the real hero here? Elena for seeing the truth or the drivers for finally standing up? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you want to see how a waitress takes down a billionaire, you better be subscribed for the climax. Elena scrambled into the back of Clara's food truck. Clara, the analog weight counter at the bridge. Does it still have the manual override? The iron crank? Clara shouted over the sound of gunfire. Yeah, but it takes 2 people to turn it. That's how we stop the ships, Elena said, her eyes wild with a sudden brilliant plan. Arthur's ships won't leave if the bridge stays open in the system. But if we physically jam the gear, the bridge won't lower. The trucks will be trapped on this side, and the police will have no choice but to see what's inside them. Julian appeared at the door of the truck, his suit torn, blood trickling down his temple. He looked at Elena, then at the chaos of his city burning around him. You're going to the bridge? He asked. I have to, Elena said. It's the only way to save those people. Julian didn't argue. He didn't tell her it was too dangerous. He simply climbed in beside her and looked at Clara. Drive. And don't stop for anything. As the food truck sped away from the ambush, weaving through the industrial labyrinth, Julian reached out and took Elena's hand. This time it wasn't out of fear or curiosity. It was out of respect. They failed, Julian whispered, looking back at the direction of the obsidian tower, where 14 experts were likely still staring at empty screens. All of them. Because they forgot that a city isn't made of data. It's made of people like you. The turning point was complete. The prey was now the hunter and the poor waitress was the one holding the leash. The old wharf bridge loomed out of the torrential rain like a rusted iron skeleton. At the edge of the channel, 2 massive container ships, Arthur Penhaligon's ghost fleet, were already churning the water, their engines humming with the vibration of a getaway. On the shore, the remaining trucks were lined up, their headlights cutting through the fog ready to board. There's the control shack. Elena pointed to a small, salt-crusted concrete hut at the base of the bridge's massive counterweights. The food truck skidded to a halt. Julian was out before the wheels stopped spinning, pulling Elena with him. They were met by a hail of gunfire from the bridge's private security detail. Arthur's men weren't hiding anymore. They were desperate. Silas and the drivers are holding the rear. Julian shouted, returning fire with a precision that silenced 2 of the mercenaries. Elena, get to the crank. I'll cover the door. Elena scrambled into the control shack. The air inside smelled of grease and old copper. In the center of the room stood a massive 5-foot-wide iron wheel, the manual override for the bridge's locking pins. If she could turn it, the bridge would remain stuck in the raised position, blocking the channel and trapping the trucks on land. She grabbed the handles. They wouldn't budge. The mechanism was seized by years of neglect and the weight of the storm. I can't, it's stuck, she screamed. Outside, a sleek black limousine pulled up. The door opened and Arthur Penhaligon stepped out, shielded by an umbrella held by a man in a tactical vest. He didn't look like a villain. He looked like a man annoyed by a minor accounting error. Julian. Arthur's voice was amplified by a bullhorn. End this. The police are 3 minutes away. If they find you here with these trucks, you are the face of this scandal. Walk away and I'll ensure the girl lives. Julian looked at the trucks, then at the shack where Elena was straining against the iron wheel until her knuckles bled. He looked at the container ships, where hundreds of innocent lives were about to be erased. You don't get it, Arthur, Julian yelled back, stepping into the open, his weapon lowered but his eyes fixed. You spent millions to buy the best experts, the best tech, the best silence. But you forgot to check the price of a waitress's soul. Inside the shack, Elena felt a shadow fall over her. Julian had entered, his shoulder bleeding from a graze. Without a word, he stepped beside her. He placed his massive scarred hands over her small bruised ones on the iron wheel. On 3, he grunted. 1, 2, 3. With a sickening screech of metal against metal, the wheel groaned. Dollar image of an industrial gears and cogwheels system. Slowly, the massive iron teeth began to grind. Outside, the bridge groaned like a dying beast. The heavy locking pins, thick as redwood trees, slid into place with a bone-shaking thud. The bridge was jammed. No! Arthur screamed, his composure finally shattering. The lead ship, unable to stop its momentum in the narrow channel, slammed its bow into the unyielding iron of the bridge. The sound of tearing steel was deafening. The ship groaned and listed, its path completely blocked. At that exact moment, a chorus of sirens erupted from the streets behind them. But they weren't the police Arthur had promised. They were the state authorities, led by a convoy of federal agents, triggered not by a digital alarm, but by the physical emergency signal Elena had forced the bridge to send when she jammed the manual gears. "It's over, Arthur," Elena whispered, stepping out of the shack into the rain. The most powerful man in the city looked at the poor waitress. He looked at the chaos she had created with a pen, a napkin, and a rusted iron wheel. He had been outplayed by the one factor he considered a variable: human decency. As the police swarmed the area, arresting the mercenaries and Arthur himself, Julian stood beside Elena. He watched as the back of the trucks were opened, not by his men but by emergency workers. He watched as people were let out into the fresh air, shivering but alive. "Before we move to the final closure of this journey, I want to see a victory in the comments if you cheered when that bridge jammed. You've been with Elena from the mop to the bridge. Make sure you're subscribed to see how her life changes after this." Julian turned to Elena. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the crumpled napkin she had drawn on hours ago. It was soaked and nearly illegible, but to him, it was the most valuable map he had ever owned. "You solved it," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he hadn't felt in decades. "In 1 minute you did what 14 experts couldn't. You saw the people." Elena looked at the ships, then at the sunrise beginning to bleed through the gray clouds. For the first time in her life she didn't feel invisible. He felt like the sun. The morning sun finally broke through the heavy Atlantic mist, turning the rain-slicked docks into a field of shimmering gold. The obsidian tower still loomed in the distance, but its power over Elena felt as thin as the shadows retreating from the light. The 14 experts were gone, whisked away by private security or taken in for questioning. Their legacy was a pile of useless tablets and the heavy scent of failure. In their place stood a new reality. The human cargo had been rescued, Arthur Penhaligon was in handcuffs, and the ghost loop that had drained Julian's empire had been closed forever. Julian Vance stood by the railing of the old wharf bridge, his expensive wool coat ruined, looking out at the city he thought he owned. He turned as Elena approached. She was still in her charcoal gray uniform, but she carried herself with a quiet authority that no title could confer. "I spoke to the conservatory," Julian said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "Your sister's tuition and administrative fees have been settled. In full. For the next 4 years." Elena stopped, the breath catching in her throat. "Julian, I didn't do this for money." "I know," he replied, a rare, genuine smile touching his lips. "That's why you're getting a lot more than just tuition. You told me earlier that people like you stay in the shadows so they don't get stepped on. I'm closing the shadows, Elena. I'm starting a new logistics division, one that focuses on the human habits you spotted. I want you to run it." Elena looked at the city, her city. 4 years she had navigated its streets as a ghost, a girl with a mop and a bank balance of $4.12. Now she saw a map of endless possibilities. She wasn't just a waitress who solved a puzzle. She was the architect of a new way of seeing the world. "I'll take the job," Elena said, her voice steady and full of hope. "But on one condition." "Anything," Julian said. "We hire the drivers. The ones who were tired. The ones who just wanted a warm meal and a moment of kindness. We don't build a system that treats them like machines. We build one that respects them." Julian nodded, reaching out to shake her hand, a formal seal on a partnership that had been forged in fire. "Agreed. We start on Monday. But first, go home, Elena. Your sister is waiting." As Elena walked away from the docks, she felt the weight of the world lift from her shoulders. She thought about the $4.12 in her account and smiled, knowing that for the first time in her life, she didn't have to count the pennies. She had found something far more valuable, her own voice. The story of the waitress who outsmarted the experts became a legend in the city's underworld and upper crust alike. It served as a reminder that intelligence isn't always found in data points or elite degrees. Sometimes, it's found in the person who notices the details everyone else is too important to see. Thank you so much for staying with us through this incredible journey of Elena's rise. Her victory is a reminder that no matter how invisible you feel, your perspective has power. If you loved this ending, please leave a comment and tell us what you think Elena's first move as a boss will be. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories where the underdog takes it all. Elena Riggs reached her apartment building just as the neighborhood was waking up. She didn't look back at the obsidian tower. She looked up at her own window, where a cello was starting to play a beautiful, triumphant melody. The waitress was gone. The expert had arrived,